The series of incidents that led to the outbreak of hostilities is a classic example of an incident that got out of hand. A quote from the historian Brian Caven from his book The Punic Wars, describing how the First Punic War actually began. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions podcast. This is the 12th episode of the Roman Empire series. This episode will begin a sequence of episodes about the First Punic War. According to historian Brian Caven, the Punic Wars were the last great wars to be fought between city-states in antiquity. Obviously, he does not mean here that there were no quote-unquote great wars, whatever that might mean, after the Punic Wars. Rather, the key term in that declaration for me really is city-states. Rome's later wars, and I do not speak here of the many skirmishes and battles to come, but rather of the large-scale wars that she fought, these conflicts will usually be between nations or empires. Because Rome, after the Punic Wars, will no longer simply be a burgeoning state focused around a single political metropolis, and its enemies will be themselves large kingdoms. This is the war that transforms Rome from just another contender into the leading force in the Mediterranean. Now, we will begin with a review of the geography and the political situation as it was prior to the war. As for my situation, if you wish to support the podcast, please head over to the website, western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org if you're not already there, and check out the various podcast series. You can also buy some merchandise on the shopping page or contribute directly to my efforts through the PayPal or Patreon options. Patreon supporters get early access to new uploads, behind-the-scenes details about the production of the podcast, and links to historical essays and videos. I also post the occasional rant about one topic or the other over there. The Western Traditions podcast is also found on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a number of other platforms. Wherever you listen, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. These are easy, free ways to support my work. And now, let's take a look at the lay of the land, as the Romans and the Greeks and the Carthaginians and others in the region, whether they know it or not, prepare for a meeting with destiny. There will be a map of the whole region posted on the website at western-traditions.org. You should either consult that map or another one online as we continue here. The conflict of the First Punic War, which begins officially in 264 BC, will be primarily centered around the island of Sicily, especially at the beginning. But let's start from the north and work our way down south on this map. In the north of this theater of war, we have Italy and Rome. Rome is not yet synonymous with Italy. There are still Gauls to the north of it, and the Romans have asserted a great deal of control over much of southern Italy, but it is not entirely subject to them yet. And culturally, anyway, the south is Greek, and it will remain culturally Greek for many centuries. In fact, to this day, there are still ancient Catholic religious rites practiced in the Greek language in southern Italy there. Central Italy, though, at this time is largely Roman. The city of Rome functions as the capital of this new realm. In the last few generations, many of the people of the land surrounding Rome have become Roman citizens. Their grandfathers were Etruscans and Samnites and Volscians and so on, but now they are all in the Roman family. They have brought some of their household gods and traditions along with them as they entered the Roman embrace, and Rome has practically ignored any religious conflict inherent in this assimilation. As long as you serve in the army and pay your taxes, come join the Roman state. Now, coming southward, we find Sicily. As we progress into the events of the war, pay special attention not just to the island, but to the point at which it nearly touches the boot of Italy. Here, between the cities of Rhegium and Messana, will spark the flame that starts the fire. But in general, consider the map and think about the place of Sicily here in the Mediterranean. The presence of this large island right here turns the entire area in the middle of the Mediterranean into a choke point. All traffic, all commerce moving east and west in the Mediterranean must make passage around this island, either to the north or to the south. We have a not unfamiliar setup here. In our own times, we have seen how trade and commerce work between developed and developing nations. In the eastern Mediterranean at this time and in the Near East over 2,000 years ago, the developed nations were Egypt and Phoenicia, Canaan, Mesopotamia, and Greece, which had recently joined the ranks of the wealthy due to Alexander's conquests in the previous century. These nations, like all developed nations, already have fine things. They already have gold and jewelry and spices. They need raw materials, and they desire to spend their disposable income on exotic things from the hinterlands. In the west of the Mediterranean, you have many unsettled regions. You have much land open to exploitation and hordes of people simply ready to be captured and brought east in slavery. Yes, there is quote-unquote civilization here in the West, as in Carthage and Rome, but these bastions of urbanized life are spread much farther apart than the multiple metropolises of the East. And so the two sides of the Mediterranean are drawn to each other in a sort of intuitive way. The East needs trade to flow east and west in order to bring them the things that they want and need to keep their societies producing. The West, while it is exploited, also desires those fine things from the East and the finished goods that they have. Now, over the course of the next 2,000 years, this commercial drama is played out again and again. The West, European countries, seeking to absorb all those fine things from the East, the silks and the spices of India and China, while they build up their own civilization and eventually become the new developed nations of the world. But none of this vital trade can happen if the passage around Sicily is not controlled. Therefore, whoever controls this island controls trade and may glean from that trade through tolls and taxes wealth just as great as that found in the East. It is not apparent that Rome really understood this or was even thinking about it when the war began, but let's stay focused on geography. We will come to motives later. Now, the northern route around the island of Sicily was in some ways the least desirable. The narrow straits between the toe of the boot of Italy and the northeast portion of the island posed a challenge to sailors. The Straits of Messina, as they are called today, narrowed to a distance of just 2 miles at one point, and this passage is characterized by rapidly changing winds and dangerous currents. It is speculated that the Odyssey, when it speaks of Odysseus's passage between the monster Scylla and the whirlpool of Charybdis, is actually describing these straits here. However, this route was desirable, nevertheless, if you were going to trade with, say, the Etruscans or the Romans or people in southern France, because it avoided the long trip around the island. I shouldn't say France, I should say Gaul. But anyway, again, these are tensions we see even in commerce in the next few centuries. And how many men died trying to find, in more recent times, the Northwest Passage, all so that ships could find a safer east-west route than that offered by the Drake Passage at the southern tip of Argentina. Eventually, people spent vast wealth to dig a canal through Panama because of these financial motives. Now, you could, of course, always take the southern route and go around the island of Sicily, but that also presented some challenges with some stretches of rocky, harborless beaches and always the great distance. But this is why Carthage was where it was. We're speaking of geography here, so let's continue to move down the map, north to south, from Sicily to Africa, as the Romans called this region. We call it Tunisia. Here, the Phoenicians long ago had realized they could not only build an excellent way station for east-west trading missions, but they could also control that trade and garner wealth from it. So as we enter the 3rd century BC, many people are benefiting from having positioned themselves at this central location in the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians in the south probably benefited more than anyone. But there are small towns in the north, one on each side of the Straits of Messina, settled and controlled by different peoples whose ancestors had probably lived there for thousands of years. And far to the north, the Romans, as we will soon hear, had already made contact with these people, had already begun to make treaties. And in the middle was Sicily itself, whose greatest city on its east coast, was the city of Syracuse. This was the last bastion of Greek power in the West. I mentioned in the last episode on Carthage that the Greeks had come pouring into the Western Mediterranean some centuries before. They were still there, but Carthage had long ago asserted her dominance over many of those lands and cities in the West. In Syracuse, as well as in southern Italy, however, there remained a strong Greek presence and tradition. You could come to Syracuse at this time and see the finest Greek plays, see plays from Aeschylus and Sophocles and others. You could hear philosophers discuss the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, Diogenes and Zeno, and more. For many decades now, the Greeks of Syracuse had been able to count on their connections in the East, where the Ptolemies ruled as Greek pharaohs over Egypt and other Greek rulers led the nations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. They could count on those connections to help sustain them, but those ties were weakening just when the power of Rome and Carthage was growing. So this coming war would pinch the Mediterranean right here, right at this crucial trading passage. The victor would obviously benefit immensely, and the loser in this conflict would also obviously be at the mercy of whomever seized control. Now, we will talk a bit about Rome and Carthage in the coming episodes, but let's pause now and take a look one last time at the Greeks of Syracuse. Much of the First Punic War will be about control of their city of Syracuse and the rest of the island of Sicily. The city of Syracuse may have begun as a colony or outpost, but by the 5th century BC, it was the equal of Athens in terms of size. Now, when compared to the great cities of the East, this is not saying much, but at the same time, for the island of Sicily anyway, that grandeur made it the leading city in the region. The site boasts an excellent harbor, and it was doubtless this which drew the original Greek colonists to settle at this specific point in the 7th century BC. They did, however, not do this unopposed. There had been local natives living in the region for perhaps thousands of years. By the 5th century BC, these natives had been turned into a slave class for their Greek masters, much like the Helots in Sparta. Now, these locals had risen up and sometimes expelled the Greeks over the course of time, but by the time of the First Punic War, the Greeks had been firmly back in power for centuries. It is perhaps an oversight of mine that I did not dedicate an entire episode in the Greek series to the dramatic history of this great city, especially because the history of the city had involved Carthage for centuries already by the time that the Romans got involved. The Carthaginians, thinking strategically and commercially, had, of course, long ago seen that possession of this city would greatly augment their own position in the world. They had tried several times to take control of it in the last 2 centuries. And if you listen to the episodes on the Peloponnesian War in my Greek history series, then you know that the city had much experience with warfare and had fought for its survival in virtually every generation. Now, around 310 BC, the Syracusans, besieged by Carthage in the latest war, decided that the best defense was a good offense, and they dared to bring the war to Africa. They landed troops near Carthage and fought the enemy in his own backyard. Eventually, the conflict resulted in a treaty between the two cities. But in 278 BC, the Carthaginians were again besieging Syracuse, and here Pyrrhus of Epirus became entwined in the history of the city. For more on Pyrrhus, see the 42nd and final episode of my Greek series. Now, by the time that the First Punic War began to brew up, Syracuse was being led by a ruler named Hiero. I've always pronounced his name in reading it Hero, but the proper pronunciation is Hiero, I guess, Hiero. He was the second tyrant of that name in the city. He would be remembered forever as one of the greatest rulers of Syracuse. Throughout his entire reign, he navigated the choppy political waters between Rome and Carthage, always maintaining both his own and his city's independence. Hiero first came to power in the city after the departure of Pyrrhus from the region. The histories that we have tell us that he was acclaimed as ruler by the army and the citizenry of Syracuse. He appears to have been one of Pyrrhus's generals. His ascent to power may have been more likely a combination of usurpation and public appreciation. I mean, after all, somebody had to take over. Why not him? Now, his involvement in this matter of the First Punic War really began in a battle near that city of Messana, which controlled the Sicilian side of the Straits of Messina. A decade before the war truly began, in 275 BC, Hiero fought against a body of mercenary troops known as the Mamertines and nearly seized the city of Messana, but was prevented from doing so by the Carthaginians. The Mamertines and the military incident for which they are remembered concerns the next segment of this episode. And as for Hiero, we will hear more about him as the war progresses. Now, the starting date for the First Punic War is given as 264 BC. This is as accurate as can be for the start of any war. Typically, though, a war has deep roots that extend many years back into the past. But perhaps the year 264 is particularly accurate because here, while all the parties involved had been in conflict in the past with one of the other parties, this was the first year in which the forces of Rome came into direct conflict with Carthage. Maybe, though, it's best if we rewind just a little bit and begin with the Mamertine incident. Now, the Mamertines were a band of mercenaries that had fought for Syracuse in some of the latest conflicts in Sicily, primarily under a man named Agathocles, who was a tyrant of Syracuse in the generation before Hiero took power. Now, the name Mamertines, given them by the Greeks, is derived from the name of the war god that they worshipped. They were actually Italians. They were from the region of Campania, and so not very different from the Romans themselves. They probably worshipped the war god Mammers, and his name is just a variant of Mars. And Mamertines appears to be the way that the Greeks called them, essentially the sons of Mars. Now, after Agathocles, tyrant of Syracuse, died in 289 BC, these mercenaries from central Italy were left unemployed, and some of them returned home. Others apparently didn't want to leave the lovely Mediterranean coastal climate and go back to a rough life in the mountains of central Italy. So they went to the city of Messana, which is today called Messina, and the story is that the people of the town were very friendly to them, and they let the mercenaries into their town peacefully. The Mamertines, though, one night, true to their nature, killed their hosts and divided up the women and the property. Truthfully, and though I have never seen this idea explored in any scholarship or any of my reading, I feel like the Mamertines were really not that much different than the Romans. And I'm not speaking here of simple genetics, though I suspect they were probably pretty closely related to the Romans by blood as well. No, I mean that the Mamertines were trying to pull off the same stunt that the Romans did centuries before, to found a new city through war, blend in with the locals by stealing their women, and try to find acceptance in the regional milieu. Only the Romans succeeded, and the Mamertines didn't. Unfortunately for them, and perhaps it was all due to bad timing and location, they tried to pull this off not in the 8th century BC, but in the 3rd century BC, and placed between the unstoppable force of Rome and the immovable object that was Carthage. Truly, they were caught between Scylla and Charybdis. Now, they had taken over Messana sometime around 288 BC, and over the next 2 decades, these mercenaries seized control of many other towns in northeast Sicily, even as they tried to turn themselves into respectable men of a commercial city. And there was ample opportunity to do this, considering that Messana was one of the 2 cities in control of the Straits of Messina, as we call this channel today. Across the narrow sea passage sat the other city that monitored this waterway, the city of Rhegium in southern Italy. But this was a very active time period. Rome was moving into southern Italy, quote-unquote, protecting its allies there, and as Rome was inclined to do, eventually turning them into Romans. This was the time also when Pyrrhus came over from Greece, and he challenged Roman expansion and lost dramatically. And this was also the time that Hiero was coming to power in Syracuse. And there was a great confusion of alliances and reversals and betrayals and invasions and the overthrowing of cities all through these years, just as we've become accustomed to in reading about the ancient world. When Pyrrhus came over, some Greek towns had welcomed him as a savior, and they turned on their Roman garrisons. Now, the Roman garrison in Rhegium, just across the way from Messana, was composed mostly of men who were of the same cultural background as the Mamertines, actually. They preempted any attempt at a revolution by the people they were protecting and simply slaughtered them and took over the town, much like the Mamertines had done across the straits. And now, though Rome could be underhanded in its geopolitics, such behavior on the part of its soldiers was disgraceful and merited punishment in their eyes. It made the Romans look bad in the international scene. You can consider its impact something like the massacre in My Lai for America during the Vietnam War. It was just the kind of thing that hampered Rome's ability to win hearts and minds. But Rome was so busy with Pyrrhus and other developments at that time that it allowed the garrison's actions to go unaddressed for many years. Meanwhile, Hiero had tried to eliminate the Mamertines in Messana and nearly conquered the city, but was prevented by the Carthaginians, who had strategically allied with these brutal men whose city overlooked the sea lanes near Rome. Now, Carthage liked that there was a confusion of power at this critical point in the sea which it did not control. It was not in Carthaginian interest to have political consolidation here, consolidation that wasn't theirs anyway, whether it was Roman or Greek or some other power. I mean, in much the same way, in more recent times, England worked for centuries to keep continental Europe divided and disunited so that it could not pose a threat to their interests. This was the real reason for their campaign against Napoleon. Now, getting back to the Punic War in 270 BC, the Romans finally took time to deal with the garrison in Rhegium. These men had turned into barely organized bandits over the years, and they were easily defeated by the Roman legions. The survivors of the attack were taken back to Rome and executed for their crimes against the citizens of Rhegium. The city was then given back to the remainder of the citizens who had survived the garrison's depredations many years before. The Mamertines were now isolated politically and militarily in northeastern Sicily, and Syracuse was growing stronger. By 265 BC, Hiero, the tyrant in Syracuse, had prepared another army to march north and get rid of the Mamertines once and for all. He was intent on becoming the heroic liberator of the Greeks in the western theater of the Mediterranean. The Romans were as yet still uninterested in the goings-on here in Sicily, and the Carthaginians had relaxed their oversight for the moment. Hiero took advantage of this opportunity and quickly scooped up one city after another in northeast Sicily until he had the Mamertines cornered in their coastal city of Messana. At this time, the Carthaginians had just a small naval force in the region, harbored in the Lipari Islands, which are just to the north of Sicily. This force was led by Hannibal, son of Gisgo, and he's not to be confused with the many other Hannibals about whom we will hear, and he's not the famous Hannibal that would invade Rome in the Second Punic War. This Hannibal, hearing about these events, rushed down to Sicily, and he met Hiero in the field outside Messana. Now, the stories about just what happened here are confused. Some say he convinced Hiero not to seize the city, due to it already being under Carthaginian protection, and that an attack would spark a general war. Others suggest that Hannibal purposely delayed Hiero while his Carthaginian mercenaries sneaked into the city and placed themselves in its citadel, and thus put Hiero in a situation where he would have to kill Carthaginians in order to seize the city. Either way, the end result was a Carthaginian garrison residing inside Messana, and Hiero and his army marching away, one more time denied the opportunity to unite the Greeks in Sicily. Hannibal left Hanno, a trusted lieutenant, in charge of the garrison, and himself returned to Carthage. Now, the Mamertines, given their new lease on life, reconsidered their situation. They did not think that the Carthaginians were very trustworthy with regard to protecting them from Syracuse. They, like Hiero, assumed that the city would just become some sort of trading token in some future disagreement, and Carthage might just turn them over in exchange for some strategic or commercial concession. And whoever took over then would surely massacre the ex-mercenaries. Anyway, the Carthaginian garrison that was there was small, and it was unable to really defend the town. They just were there representing Carthage politically. So the Mamertines sent an embassy to Rome. Now, until then, Rome had only brought cities in Italy properly into its league, and they had executed men very similar to the Mamertines in Rhegium not too long ago. So there was reason to believe that the Romans would find the deal possibly distasteful or simply not interesting enough, or maybe too complicated with the Syracusan and Carthaginian interests involved. Perhaps, though, the Mamertines saw that the always ambitious Romans would see the advantage of holding both sides of the Straits of Messina, and perhaps this is why the Romans agreed to the alliance. Surely, Rome did not consider that this would be an offense against the Carthaginians. There's no sign that they knew that they were taking on Carthage, nor did they seek any conflict with that great city. They probably saw the conflict just in terms of Mamertines versus Syracuse, and they were willing to make enemies with the last remaining Greek power in the region. Now, this deal with the Mamertines may or may not have been an alliance. Officially, the Mamertines gave themselves up to, quote-unquote, Roman protection, but perhaps it was an official alliance. Records are not clear, but regardless, the Romans did accept the Mamertines into some kind of relationship. And once this was official, that same year then, the Mamertines revealed this new political stance to Hanno, the commander of the Carthaginian garrison in their city, and they let him know that his services were no longer needed. This left Hanno in a bind. He did not have orders to seize the city or fight against the Mamertines, and really, the whole issue was still up in the air. He merely knew that he was to command the troops and represent Carthage here. Even if he refused to leave, he did not have enough men to take the city or even sustain the defense of the citadel. But departing would also have its consequences, accepting on behalf of his entire nation the dispelling of an alliance arranged by his superior, recognizing the existence of a new alliance of possible enemies. He was in above his head. Whatever choice he made would be the wrong one. And it was. He departed the city with his men and was called home to Carthage, where he was crucified. Over the following winter, as 265 BC became 264, Hiero made an alliance with Carthage. The Carthaginians, unlike the Romans, saw things not in black and white, but in subtle hues of shifting colors. If they allowed Hiero to fight on his own, and he was victorious, however unlikely that seemed, there would result a consolidation of power in the region that was not in the Carthaginian interest. And if the Romans defeated him and put the seal on their possession in Sicily, this would also be unfavorable. If the Carthaginians kept themselves involved, though, they could ensure that the result of the war was something favorable to them, probably something involving a division of powers and possessions. Neither Rome nor Carthage, most likely, saw the coming conflict as a grand war, not just for control of the Mediterranean, but for ownership of the future. Rome, as I said, was focused on defeating Syracuse and continuing the creeping expansion of her power and influence. Carthage merely wanted to establish a status quo which preserved her economic interests. What was coming, however, was a century-long engagement which would result in the glorious victory of Rome and the complete annihilation of Carthaginian power. In the next episode, we will look at the early battles of the First Punic War and the changing political landscape of the Mediterranean as each side armed for a war that no one saw coming. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.